Well, good morning, everybody. Nice to have you here. Welcome to folks in the room. Welcome to folks online or watching on video. Where it's once again, who do you say I am? Encountering the Newer Testament. We're working our way through the Gospels. Today, the Gospel according to Luke. So I'm excited. I hope you're excited too. I know that when Margaret asked what people's favorite Gospels were, that Luke got a lot of hands. So I'm going to try not to wreck that today. You don't have to like Luke more when you leave, but hopefully you won't despise it or anything like that. Luke is a fun gospel. They're all fun, but each in its own way. So some things to know, and this might be the last week I put up this slide, but other things that are happening or things you might want to know about. We have an interview that I believe is on the website, should be on the website, with Raj Nadella. Raj teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. He does a lot of work on the Gospel of Luke. He's really engaging. And then we've got, materials. We've got a timeline of Newer Testament history on the webpage. There's maps, other kinds of things like that, a recommended readings list. And then, of course, there's a cart with books in Westminster's own libraries if you're interested in digging deeper into the Newer Testament, or just to ask either Margaret or myself for recommendations. We are here to oversupply you. And there's more. If you really like Luke or want to read more on Luke, I wrote a bunch of material on the gospel for a website that Luther Seminary produces called enterthebible.org, which has resources on all 66 books of the Bible, but I did the work on Luke. So if you like Luke, like me, or don't like Luke, don't like me, whatever, just know it's there, it's free. Go to Enter the Bible, click on Luke, and I at least stand by what I wrote there. So there's that. To get us into Luke, I want to start off by just digging into a passage that strikes me as kind of quintessentially Luke's, like Lucan. It's very much a story that where there's themes and there's things that happen that just really kind of fit Luke. And so I want to start us with a passage before we do the larger 30,000-foot kind of flyover interview. So a passage we only see in Luke's gospel, we only find in Luke's gospel. And I'll read it out loud, and then we'll have some chance to talk about it. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with compassion for her, and said to her, "Do not cry." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stopped. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." The word about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding region. This strikes me as a particularly well-told story, or a story that has just a lot of themes and interests. And so I want to start off by just inviting you at your tables to talk about, what do you see? Are there particular details or words or observations in the passage that just strike you as important or kind of worthy of your attention? Maybe there are details that help make the story a little more vibrant or a little more colorful for you. Maybe there's details that give you a sense of what the story is really about. Really whatever you want. But I just want to invite you into some conversation for 5 minutes. Hopefully that the print's large enough you can see it in the back. We do have Bibles in the back as well. But is your task clear here? What do you think of the story of Jesus at Nain in Luke 7? All right, so I'll set a timer for 5 minutes. Folks who are online, use the chat. Communicate back and forth. We've got Tim here watching the chat. He needs company. So, all right, you're free. You get 5 minutes. You have 2 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to call us back together. We've got a microphone we can pass around. I'm curious, what are some observations that came up at your table? What sparked conversation at your table? Mark's way in the back, but he'll get here.
Microphone. I thought that standing in back would be the best place to be.
Opposite. Well, one thing our table was talking about was we're curious about the age of this mother. Like, she could have been 28. How old were boys when they were considered men? 16? 14? So we're just curious about the age.
Right.
Like, I think I used to imagine the story as like this old woman with this like adult man, but that might not be the case.
Right.
I don't know why I said those words with that inflection, but anyway.
That's quite all right. Yeah, so there's obviously some cultural questions here about age and what that would mean in terms of her vulnerability. There's clearly there are issues here about being in a patriarchal society, right? Where what does that mean to be widowed in this case? Not all widows in the ancient world were destitute or in financial jeopardy, but a lot of them were. So that's part of it, right? There's this interesting cultural dynamic. Other things that caught attention, that generated conversation. You were all talking about something. Here in the front, Mark. Oh, also there.
Well, we talked about how this son, or this person who had died, was the only person in this woman's life. Mm-hmm. It was only son, and she was a widow.
Yeah. Right. So if there's other family, we don't know about it, but it appears that this is big news for her. I'm also always interested in the fact that he was moved with compassion for her. He doesn't seem to be sad about the young man who's passed away. And then the dead man sat up and began to speak. We don't know what he speaks, but then what does Jesus do? He gives him back to his mother. So it's an interesting, he's obviously in the story in a character, but the miracle appears to be on her behalf more so than his, or at least primarily on her behalf, which is, I imagine he's happy to be alive again, but we just don't know anything about that.
We had another kind of comment from the live stream.
Sure.
One of our listeners says that the story points out how frightening it would be to be a witness to such a thing. A person who was dead becomes alive again. Scary.
Yeah, there's an honesty there, right? Fear seized all of them. And they glorify God, which is also interesting, right? That there's this two really strong emotions or responses, right, with each other.
Our first points of reference were that Jesus is called to compassion and action, that he inserts himself in this experience.
Yeah. I love that. The Greek word for compassion is a lovely word that you should all know. The verb is splanchnizomai, and splankna were your entrails or your intestines. And so for the ancients, the seat of compassion, or that kind of deep feeling, is literally in your bowels. Like we would talk about our hearts, right? People have different kind of ways of locating emotions in head or heart. I wouldn't say his bowels moved. That'd be a little gross, but there is some kind of visceral churning behind that word. You know what I mean? That's more than just I feel bad for her. But and then he inserts himself. He literally stops the wedding procession. It's rather rude. You know, the stranger shows up, and I imagine him like kind of stopping this, and he puts his hand on the stretcher, you know, and everybody's like, what are you doing? Yeah, very interesting.
On that same point, our table was talking about the idea that they didn't say the people were skeptical or that they didn't believe it. They said they were fearful and then, you know, sort of awestruck. And that's kind of interesting because you might think that people would think this is just a party trick and, you know, it's not real, but that doesn't sound like it's part of the story at all. So obviously everybody bought the fact that he really was dead and then is brought to life again, and that's just kind of curious because it's kind of an unusual act.
Kind of, indeed, yeah. Throughout the Gospels, none of his opponents ever say you're a fake or you're a charlatan or something, or you're trying to just bilk people out of their money or something like that. The question is always, whose power is at work here? Is this a divine act, or is this something demonic, or what's going on?
We also identified the fact that she did not ask for this.
Right.
And that, you know, it came to her. We also wondered about that the word spread out to the surrounding areas. Typically, Jesus was saying, you know, shh, don't say anything. So is there anything that follows this that indicates that maybe he doesn't want this to spread?
Not this particular story, no. Luke has a little bit of Jesus being concerned about secrecy, but not as much as like Mark, for example, 2 weeks ago. That's interesting. I think I have time for one more bit of feedback, and then we'll move on.
So I thought after 4 minutes you were dead. Your brain couldn't speak, especially couldn't speak. But why? I thought about, you know, the Saved by the Bell, the saying Saved by the Bell, which came from the idea of hanging a bell inside of a casket, because in olden times people thought people had died when in fact they were in a state of comatose. So when Jesus raises him from the dead, I wonder if he's really been dead, especially when he's able to speak. There you go.
There you go.
That's my
We don't know how long he's been dead. We don't know anything else about this. Good. That's good modern skepticism coming to the story. I like that. A lot of details here we could talk about. The way it's staged is interesting. It's at the gate of a town, obviously a threshold spot. In ancient cities, people buried the dead outside the city walls. The gate is also usually where justice is decided. It's where a lot of trade takes place. It's a very public area. There's a large crowd with this woman, and Jesus, I kind of have this idea of these two groups, Jesus's group and then the funeral group, you know, meeting. And there's this, not really a confrontation in a hostile way, but certainly something major happens here. And then you also have this lovely line Jesus gave him to his mother. The Greek there matches word for word the Greek translation of an Old Testament story about the prophet Elijah, who raises the son of a widow at Zarephath. This is in 1 Kings, if you want to look it up, chapter 17. The exact same line. So it's very interesting. Jesus is doing something that recalls Elijah, which might explain why people say a great prophet has risen among us. In other words, this looks familiar to some people, these kinds of deeds ring a bell, different kind of bell than what Betty was talking about, for sure. So some things to notice about Luke. Luke's got a particular kind of artistry in his writing, loves to refer to Old Testament stories and kind of cast Jesus in this role of some familiar Old Testament characters, particularly prophets. And so we'll keep digging into some of these things in a minute. I want to go back to the very beginning of Luke's gospel. And if you were here, I believe it was 3 weeks ago, when I talked about gospels in general, I walked us through the prologue, the first 4 verses of Luke's gospel. The author is actually addressing readers. And it's just an interesting, it's one sentence. It's a rather long sentence. It's a little tortured grammatically, but it's pretty good Greek. It's some of the best Greek in the whole New Testament, as if this is the author kind of showing his bona fides as a historian and as a writer. And I want to just highlight 2 things here. Is one, that the author talks about how he decided to write a gospel. He decided to write a narrative about the life of Jesus, having a grasp of everything from the start, seeming to suggest that he's done some research. He's looked into these stories. He tells us that he was not an eyewitness of Jesus. He comes from maybe a second generation of Christ followers. And he decided to write a well-ordered account. In other words, he decided to write in an orderly way. And that doesn't mean chronologically in terms of the sequence. It means in a way that would make sense to people. In other words, he's acknowledging, I'm trying to organize the story. I'm trying to present the story in a way that will make sense to you. Maybe he means better sense than some of these other gospels. Because he wants the readers, and here he talks about a reader named Theophilus, to have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. In other words, the author imagines the readers to already know quite a bit probably about Jesus, and maybe even to know these stories. And so here at the outset, he's confessing, maybe I'm going to embellish a few things, maybe I'm going to rearrange the sequence a bit. I'm going to try to tell this in a way that helps the story make more sense. And more sense doesn't necessarily mean more intellectually credible, but what are the themes that might be developed throughout the course of this gospel? What is the author trying to make sure we notice about who Jesus is? So I love this opening. It's a bit of a confession of a historian's own prerogative, to tell the story in an engaging way, in a meaningful way, which we know from other ancient histories, This is what historians did. You have to tell history in a way that tries to usher people into the moment. You have to tell an interesting story. No historian, especially in the ancient world, is just writing facts and figures for the sake of facts and figures. There's something persuasive going on here. So just to note that. This author has sometimes in Christian tradition been referred to as a physician. If any of you have ever gone to a church of St. Luke, I guarantee you there's medical symbolism in your stained glass windows there, probably, right? Was the author really a physician? We don't know. But that's the way church history has remembered him. There's nothing in the writing that suggests a particular medical vocabulary or anything like that. But try telling that to somebody who worships at St. Luke's church. They usually don't want to hear that. But nevertheless, it does come from somebody whose Greek is better than most other New Testament authors. And from his style, we can tell he's had a particular kind of classical education in terms of the way he writes. So what does the author seem to be doing? The author is telling the story about Jesus in a way that exercises some kind of editorial freedom, which helps us get to the question then of what's different and what's the same compared to the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Mark, probably the first of the New Testament Gospels to have been written. Last week, Margaret led us into Matthew's Gospel, and so Luke is a lot like Mark and Matthew, except when it's not, If you're a Bible scholar, you love the things that are different about it. You love the individuality of them. What do I mean on this slide? Mark has a particular sequence. Mark tells the story of Jesus in a way. Matthew's gospel follows that sequence almost perfectly. Matthew adds other things. Matthew had other stories to tell. Matthew is about twice as long as Mark. Luke, however, really alters the sequence of stories in a number of places. So that's interesting, We can tell, again, the author is doing something rhetorically, trying to make a case. About 95% of Mark's gospel has parallel scenes or parallel sayings in Matthew's gospel. Luke, however, leaves out some significant chunks of Mark's gospel. In other words, he's not just building off of Mark, he's kind of using Mark and rearranging And some of the material we find in Matthew that's also in Luke is just arranged differently in Luke. So again, we have an author who's, again, not breaking the story or rewriting the story, but trying to arrange it in sensible ways. I think I talked to you, right? Anytime somebody asks you, what did you do today or what did you do this week, you're probably not going to tell the story chronologically, right? It'll be rather boring if you did, unless you're trying to say like all of the things that made you angry in a particular meeting or something like that. About half of Luke is material that appears in no other gospel. This is really interesting to me, at least, right? This gospel is almost twice as long as Mark. There's a lot in here that we would not know about if it were not for Luke, right? In other words, Luke has a lot of unique material. In 2 weeks, we'll look at John. John has a ton of unique material, but that's John. And the author of Luke also wrote a sequel. In other words, there's a part 2 to this. The Acts of the Apostles, which Margaret will lead us into next Sunday, is part 2. It's the same author. We know this because of the style and the way that Acts starts off. So that's just interesting, right? The same author then, whoever this Luke was responsible for about a quarter of the entire New Testament between Luke and Acts together. So a significant voice, right? And a significant source of our information. I want to zero in on this question about half of Luke being material that appears in no other gospel. Just to talk a bit about what is that, but then also to talk about so what. Sound good? Any questions at this point? All right, that's the overview. Mustafa, can I get you the microphone for the sake of people online? Mark, can you over? Thank you.
Just in that previous slide, there is that word servant of the world right there. I just want to know the Greek, if it's that translated servant of the logos or?
I'm guessing it's logos. I'd have to look it up. Yeah. But probably not meaning that in the way like we see it in John's gospel, but right, that word, the Greek word for word can mean about 50 different things and has a whole, we'll get to that more in 2 weeks for sure. All right. Good. So I'm just going to fly through the slide that you just saw. A simple outline of Luke's gospel. You've now read the prologues. You're already, ankle deep into Luke. And then the rest of chapters 1 and chapter 2 recount the births, the conceptions and then the births of both John the Baptist and Jesus. A lot of our Advent stories come out of here. A lot of the Christmas pageant comes out of here. We've got the birth of Jesus because there's a census and Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem and the shepherds are told about it by the angels. You know that story coming up in 2 months. Matthew's gospel has no shepherds, has no angelic announcement. It has the Magi, right? The folks from the east who come and bring gifts. We always combine Matthew and Luke at the Christmas pageant. Every church combines Matthew and Luke at the Christmas pageant. Unless you're a church of only like 3 or 4 kids, then you can get away with only doing Luke. It's part of the fun, right? But to notice that, this is where we get 3 songs as well, or 3 canticles. Mary, the mother of Jesus, has a very well-known one referred to as the Magnificat in some settings. If you're a singer, you've probably sung a version of it somewhere sometime. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, has at the end of chapter 1 a song where he talks about what God is doing, what Jesus will do, what John will do. And then a man named Simeon at the end of chapter 2, or near the end of chapter 2, has a very short one where he's an old man who's told he will not die until he sees the Messiah, and he takes the baby Jesus into his arms. And the song begins with saying to God, "You are now dismissing your servant in peace." In other words, I'm now ready to die, having seen this. Luke 1 and 2, I'll come back to that in a minute, but for my money, these are the best 2 chapters in the entire Bible. They're just poetic. The imagery is beautiful. The hope is beautiful. Jesus and John are born into a world that looks like they're doing nothing but expecting them. Right, the expectations are high, the hopes are high. Then you turn from chapter 2 to chapter 3, and Jesus is fully grown, and the dream's over. Right, nobody seems to have remembered this. Life is hard, But chapters 1 and 2, there's just something romantic about those that I find really compelling. Most of the very end of chapter 2, and then into chapter 4, this is like John the Baptist's story. and things like Jesus being tested in the wilderness. We see similar accounts in both Mark and in Matthew. The public ministry of Jesus in and around Galilee, most of chapter 4, well into chapter 9. The story we saw from Luke 7 was different, but a lot of the stories here will sound familiar to you if you've read Mark and Matthew. And then it changes. At the end of chapter 9, we're told that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. It's this really peculiar line in chapter 9, verse 51. He sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and so begins what scholars with no creativity whatsoever have called the travel narrative. And the travel narrative lasts for about 10 chapters, and it's Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. And what's peculiar about these 10 chapters is there are almost no time references or geographical references. In other words, we have no idea if this is a week journey or if this is like a 3-year journey. It just, time kind of collapses. And in this section is where we get, the vast majority of this section is material that we find only in Luke's gospel. In other words, the author appears to have kind of collected a bunch of stories. Some of these are parables, some of these are encounters that Jesus has with other people, and put them in the context of him traveling to Jerusalem for his death. He's also expecting to be rejected in Jerusalem. He laments over the city. It's a very kind of a poignant journey for him, but a lot of interesting material right there. And nobody can quite tell exactly what the logic behind the arrangement is. Some places there's a lot of stories about wealth and possessions clustered together. Some places there's other healing stories together. But it's if you only have time to read 10 chapters from Luke, well, you should read 1 and 2 really, but you should read these 10 chapters as well. Jesus is in Jerusalem like he is in all the other Gospels, holding court in the temple precinct and making a lot of people angry, having discussions about teaching and the law and the future of the temple. A lot of that is familiar with other Gospels. The arrest and the trials of Jesus and the crucifixion are told in slightly different ways. More on that in a couple of minutes. And then Luke 24, we've got some of our best-loved resurrection stories. Mark, you might remember, ends at an empty tomb. Matthew's gospel, there's very little material, kind of post-resurrection material. The people do meet with Jesus, but he does not last for long. At least in Luke, we've got a full chapter of stories. And then Luke ends with the ascension. So if Mark is a gospel that's really fast-paced, that begins with Jesus and John as fully grown human beings, that ends with an empty tomb and everybody terrified, Luke is like, we're going to nail down the ends of this story a lot better, right? So Luke's I'm not even going to tell you where Jesus was born. I'm going to tell you how he was conceived, right, by the Holy Spirit. And at the very end, Jesus has ascended back into heaven, and now it's all up to his followers who are waiting in Jerusalem. The book of Acts will then take it from there. Do you see what I mean? An author who's much more concerned about letting you know where he came from and where he is now. So I want to highlight just kind of 10 things that I think, I could pull out probably 30 passages, but I wanted to pull out 10 passages that might be familiar to some of you and that might help you get a sense for some of this unique material, some of this material we get only in Luke's gospel, and reflect a little bit about why that matters then. So I mentioned the infancy narratives earlier, kind of told you why I think they're great. Not only is there a lot of poetry in here, but the poetry very much is conversant with the Older Testament. In other words, the singers, Mary, Zechariah, and Simeon, are all kind of pulling out imagery and lines or phrases from the Older Testament and applying those to Jesus. It's one reason we probably think these were written by the author himself. These are probably not transcripts of somebody. Mary is alone with Elizabeth, her relative, when she sings the Magnificat. And so it might be the author saying, I think this is probably what would happen if a woman realized she was going to give birth to the Messiah. She would say something like this. I think this is what, maybe, who knows where they came from, but they're very careful to make sure that we know that the God everybody is excited about in Luke 1 and 2, with Elizabeth pregnant with John, Mary pregnant with Jesus, the God everybody's excited about is the same God they all know from the Older Testament. In other words, Luke is very careful to knit this story deeply, richly into a story that's already underway. And in fact, one of my favorite things about teaching this, the Greek of Luke 1 and 2 is different from the rest of the story. It very much imitates the Greek in the Greek translation of certain parts of the Older Testament, in particular the books of Samuel and Kings. In other words, the author is kind of writing in character. It's like, how you can subtly do that. If I was to slip into like King James English right now, you'd all be confused, but right, it would evoke something, it would change something. When you watch a film, you might not even be aware of what the soundtrack is, but it's affecting your mood in some way. It's helping set a place. And in some ways, the voice of the author here is saying, this is the same old story. We're not talking about a new God. We're talking about the faithfulness of the God we already know about. Another scene, Jesus' sermon at Nazareth. Anybody remember how Mark begins? Remember, there's Jesus is tested in the wilderness. He picks a couple of disciples. What's the first big public event in Mark's gospel for Jesus' ministry? He's in a synagogue, and that's in this scene. He does read from Isaiah here. In Mark, there's an exorcism. So like right out of the gate, the first thing is, bam, this confrontation with the demonic. Last week, Margaret talked about the first thing that happens is Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters of teaching. In Mark, come to the sermon at 10:30, we're going to talk about liberation. In Mark, Jesus is a liberator, right? Come to do battle with the things that harm humanity. In Matthew, Jesus is very much a teacher. He's more than these things, but this is kind of what comes right out of the gate. In John's gospel, in 2 weeks, the first big event is turns water into wine at a wedding, right? Abundance and something a little joyful about all of that. In Luke, the first thing is his sermon, his hometown sermon. He goes back to Nazareth. He reads from Isaiah, where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. I'm not quoting this right. This is my own mixed up paraphrase, like Luke. To recovery of sight to the blind, to proclaim the year of God's favor. And then it's the best sermon ever because it only lasts one sentence. Jesus sits down and he says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. That's it. Take the offering, strike up the choir. Nice short service. I know, you're not going to get that at 10:30, sorry. It's a moment. It's his inaugural address, right? It's his saying, "This is what my ministry is going to be about. This is what I have come to do," and it's very much a statement about liberation, a statement about being among those who are less fortunate in society. The hometown crowd loves the sermon so much they try to kill him at the end of the scene. So put that out of your mind. Other scenes that I think are significant. There's 3 verses at the beginning of chapter 8 where Luke introduces us to at least 3 women who are part of Jesus's company. And in Matthew and in Mark, you would be forgiven if you thought it was just Jesus and 12 men spending all of their time together. Except after Jesus dies in both Matthew and Mark, there's a statement where it says, now some women were watching the crucifixion from a distance, and these women used to travel with Jesus throughout Galilee and help support the movement. And you're like, why are you telling us now? Why are you telling us after Jesus has died? Luke, at least, only 3 verses, I don't want to overdo this, but at least talks about how among Jesus are a group of women, and it says among them, so it names 3, but implies there are more, Joanna, Susanna, and Mary Magdalene. It also tells us that all 3 are patrons of the movement in some way, which is significant. If they're running around going village to village and camping out, somebody's got to have some money, right, to make this thing work. And it's them. They're also described, it doesn't use the word disciples for them, but the things they are doing are this exact same stuff the other disciples are doing in terms of being with Jesus. So it's an important reminder that it's not Jesus and 12 guys, on an extended camping trip or something like that, right? But this is a ministry that's attracting a variety of kinds of women, or people, and women are welcome. If women are present, that almost certainly means children are present too in the ancient cultural understanding of what's going on here. So that's significant. We know more about Mary Magdalene from other biblical stories, other gospel stories. Joanna and Susanna, we would probably not know anything about had Luke not mentioned them here. I'll keep going. The parable of the Good Samaritan, you probably have heard this one. Stop me if you've heard this one before, right? This is the parable Jesus tells when he's having a conversation with a Jewish legal expert about loving one's neighbor. And the response the man gives is, well, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells a parable, which is what he's prone to do. Matthew and Luke are where we get almost all of the parables. No parables in John. Mark has only a few. And this one is astounding because the hero is, of course, a Samaritan, right? One of those people, right? One of those, if you're a Jew who lives in Galilee or Judea, the Samaritans are these people in your family tree who are just really messed up and you really wish they would go away. They're not Gentiles, but they're not quite Jewish like us, would be the attitude. And the Samaritans feel the same way. And so, you know, Jesus is a great storyteller, so he tells this story about a man who's been beaten, he's lying in a ditch, and a priest goes by, a Levite goes by, 2 religious professionals go by. And so everybody knows, well, the third character is going to be the hero, right? That's just how folk tales, that's how stories work. And the first word out of Jesus' mouth is a Samaritan. And you can just see everybody going, no, like no, tell a better story. So it's an offensive story to his crowd, right? Which makes it such an effective story. Amy Jo Levine has a line where she says, to understand this story, you have to imagine who's the person in the world that if you saw them coming, you would think, I would rather die than receive help from that person. Maybe you don't have an enemy like that, but the parable of the prodigal son and his brother, only in Luke's gospel. More on that in just a little bit. It comes after Jesus tells a parable about a lost sheep. Stop me if you've heard this one before, right? Somebody's got 100 sheep. One becomes lost. He leaves 99 alone to go search out the one. A woman has 10 coins. She loses one. She turns her house upside down trying to find it, so determined to find it. At the end of both of those parables, there's a refrain where the finder, the shepherd, and then the woman both call out to their neighbors and they say, I found the thing that I've lost, come and celebrate with me. In other words, the proper response to the finding of a lost thing is joy, celebration. What's funny about that is if they're going to celebrate, she's probably going to have to spend the coin. So there's something that's delightful about that story. This thing is of such value, and then finding it is like, well, let's just spend it, right? There's a kind of joy and abundance in those stories. And then the parable of the prodigal son is the third in a string. Luke has a lot of difficult teachings about wealth, and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus is maybe one of the most uncomfortable ones of those. For me at least, it's about a man who's wealthy. We're told he dresses in fine purple linen, which is the most expensive fabric in the ancient world, and every day he feasts sumptuously, I think is how the King James Version puts it. We never know his name, but we know the name of a man named Lazarus who sits at the man's gate, and we're told is covered in sores, and the dogs lick his sores, and he has nothing. And the parable ends, and there's this reversal where Lazarus is being comforted in paradise while the rich man is suffering in the torments of Hades. It's a reminder of what Mary talks about in chapter 1, where she talks about the poor being lifted up and the rich being thrown down, right? The weak being elevated. It's this image of reversal. And in some ways that plays out in this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. I love this one. Jesus heals 10 men with a skin disease. And we're told afterwards that only one comes back to say thank you to Jesus. He sends them off to go cleanse themselves, and they become well on their way. And only one comes back, and the one who comes back happens to be, you guessed it, a Samaritan again, right? The one who takes the time to show gratitude is the outsider, the one who's supposed to be pretty clueless when it comes to religious matters. Zacchaeus, you all love Zacchaeus. Only in Luke's gospel, this is the wealthy tax collector who climbs a tree because he wants to see Jesus. We're told he's seeking Jesus. Jesus stops underneath the tree, right? Looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, hurry down. I must come to your house tonight. It's incredibly rude. Jesus invites himself over for dinner. And Zacchaeus hosts him, right? So you've got hospitality as part of this. And that story ends with Jesus saying that the Son of Man, he has come to seek and to save the lost. That same word seek that describes Zacchaeus, right? So Zacchaeus is on a quest. He's seeking to see who Jesus is. Jesus somehow knows exactly who he is, picks him out of the tree, and talks about his own quest to find this person. Big questions about just how miserable of a human being is Zacchaeus or not. We're told he's a chief tax collector, which is a word we don't find in any other Greek literature prior to Luke's gospel. In other words, it might be a word that Jesus made up, right? He's like the tax collector of tax collectors, right? He's at the top of the pyramid. All the things that are supposed to make us, start to grumble and think, this is a horrible person. No way would Jesus have compassion for him. But the man's life turns around. I mentioned the crucifixion earlier is slightly different. Only Luke's gospel has the story of one of the people crucified with Jesus turning to him and saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You heard that line? And Jesus says to him, tell you truly, today you will be with me in paradise, right? It's this lovely line, this lovely scene, right, of somebody who's literally down to his final breaths and turns to Jesus just to ask to be remembered, and Jesus issues a promise. Mark's gospel, Jesus dies by screaming, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew's gospel, Jesus dies, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke's gospel, he's still saving on the cross, right? Even in Jesus' own final breaths, he's promising salvation to this man. His dying words in Luke are, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So a different way of describing that death, right? Much more trusting, so to speak. When we get to John in 2 weeks, we'll see a different death scene. All of the gospel authors are characterizing how Jesus dies in particular ways, which is a very, very big deal in the Greco-Roman world. If you want a story about your hero, how they're born and how they die are very important stories to remember, right? In a society so obsessed with honor. Last one, this is the 10th one I wanted to highlight, where Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus, or in Emmaus. You might remember this story. He's been crucified. Some people have, the women who go to the tomb to anoint him on Sunday morning report the tomb is empty. A man named Cleopas and his companion are on their way out of town. They know the story. They run into Jesus on the road. Somehow their eyes are kept from recognizing him. He talks to them on the road. They invite him to eat with them in Emmaus, this village somewhere near Jerusalem. And it's not until he breaks the bread where it says their eyes were opened and they recognized him. So it's this haunting and lovely story of disclosure happening, not because he explained everything to them on the road, right, but because they sat down to eat with him, and something through the sharing of the food, the breaking of the bread, he becomes known to them. And then, talk about weird stories, Betty, like poof, he disappears from their sight and shows up again in the next scene. It's this interesting reminder, he's the same old Jesus. He's still recognizable, but not quite recognizable, right? And he's suddenly disappearing. His body is doing different things than it did before, right? A fascinating story. In all of these, and we could go on, I could keep you another hour. We could look at 10 more stories or 20 more stories. There's some themes that start to develop. And one of them, I think, is that Luke appears to be speaking to churches, to Christians who are engaged in practices of welcome, generosity, worship, and fellowship. More, but that's part of what's going on. And so a lot of these stories of encounters are very important in Luke's gospel. And so just to highlight a couple of themes, outsiders show up a lot. Never know quite the right word to use. Outsiders isn't maybe the best word. Sometimes people will talk about the marginalized, but that's kind of a nerdy word. I mean, basically people who are kind of, live kind of on the underside of society in some ways. So a lot of attention to people who are suffering from health problems, or people who have bad reputations. Questions about poverty matter a lot in this gospel. They accuse Jesus of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Right? He's with the wrong crowd throughout this gospel, and he likes eating with them. He likes spending time with them. He's also accused in Luke of being a glutton and a drunkard, which I like. So he's not an ascetic in this gospel, right? He appears to not just be with this crowd, but really enjoys hanging out with them until late at night, right? And you can just see how that would just really bother some of the religious leaders who think that, they're too beneath him or something like that. And so meals, there are a ton of meal stories in Luke's gospel. 19 references to meals, including some in parables. 13 are unique to Luke. For some reason, this gospel likes to show us scenes of Jesus around tables. Part of that has to do with what sharing a meal, what hospitality meant in the ancient world, the kinds of friendships and bonds that get formed around those ancient meals. They are also in Luke's gospel at times opportunities for transformation, declarations of belonging, new discoveries, opportunities for teaching. Disciples in Emmaus, for example, the meal is their moment of discovery of who they are with. There's a lovely story in Luke chapter 7 about a woman with a bad reputation in the neighborhood, and Jesus pronounces her forgiveness when he's being hosted by a Pharisee at his house. He's always eating in this gospel, or he's always on his way to eat in this gospel, or he's just come from eating in this gospel. We get a sense of how he socializes with people. A lot of stories about wealth and generosity in Luke. It makes it a difficult gospel to read in places. Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount. In Jesus, there's the Sermon on the Plain. Says a lot of the same things, just interesting how they're set in different places. The Sermon on the Plain, there's something about it that's much more earthy than the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount begins with, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Luke's gospel, he just says, blessed are you who are poor. Slight difference there, right? But he's very much concerned with people who are suffering poverty. He'll say, blessed are you who weep and who mourn as well in this. There's just kind of a focus on people's material condition in Luke's gospel that's rather stark. So a lot of material that addresses wealth and privilege. There's a parable about a guy that Jesus refers to as a fool. This is a wealthy man who has a great year farming, and he tears down his barns and he builds new, bigger ones, stores everything, and he says, I'm going to tell my soul, eat, drink, and be merry, right? Your life is secured. And then the voiceover, so to speak, in the parable says, you fool, tonight your life is demanded of you, and who's going to get all of your stuff? Again, I'm paraphrasing, right? And one of the things going on in that parable is this man speaks to himself, right? He speaks to himself in the first person singular. There's nobody else in the parable, right? This man who's been blessed with such a great harvest, right? Never thinks of how it might benefit anybody beyond himself. I mentioned the rich man and Lazarus. The story of Zacchaeus is a story about wealth as well, where Zacchaeus promises or declares that he gives away money. Luke's gospel also has a very stark line where Jesus says, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions. People always call in the Bible scholar to say, this part's really confusing. Can you help me make sense of it? And then passages like this, you're like, this is really straightforward. Can you help make this a little fuzzier for me? Right? I mean, or like, why so many riddles from Jesus? Why won't he speak plainly? And then he says something like this, and you're like, oh, I preferred the riddles, right? I mean, this is, it's a tough passage, right? And today, the sermon from is looking at Mark's gospel today, which is a similarly difficult passage. Luke is very concerned about what people do with their, I should say Jesus in Luke is very concerned about what people do with their money. He puts it really starkly in Luke chapter 16. He says, none of you can serve God and wealth, or God and mammon is the Greek word there, suggesting that mammon or wealth can function like a god, just as God can. So in many ways, wealth is characterized as a competing god that demands loyalty. Some of this carries over into the book of Acts as well, where we get glimpses of life in the early church, where people are sharing their possessions with one another. Luke's very interested in how these new communities of Christ followers are taking care of one another. Salvation now. In Luke's gospel, salvation takes place wherever Jesus is. In other words, the cross in Luke's gospel appears not to be like the place where salvation happens. It happens when Jesus is born. There's references to the incarnation, right? Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Jesus' origins are mysterious. And when Simeon, this old man in the temple in Luke chapter 2, picks up Jesus, one of the things he says is, my eyes have seen your salvation, right? Salvation is wherever Jesus is. When he sees Zacchaeus, he says, salvation has come to this house. In other words, it's not about necessarily waiting for the cross. The cross is important in Luke, but it's not the place where salvation fully takes place. There's something about wherever Jesus goes that makes salvation possible. Part of this is about fulfillment. There's a lot of language about fulfillment. What God has promised in the Older Testament is now available, and salvation is offered and presently available in Jesus and his deeds. One of the things I like about Luke is it puts a lot of significance onto the incarnation, onto the idea of God coming in human flesh, of God being among us. And this salvation is not just forgiveness. You can't just equate it simply to forgiveness. There are spiritual aspects, there are physical aspects, there are social aspects. The last big thing is there's a lot of worship and prayer in Luke's gospel. Occasionally calls attention to people engaged in worship. Jesus himself prays a lot in this gospel. He prays before the Holy Spirit comes after his baptism. He prays before he chooses the 12 disciples. He prays before the transfiguration. There's frequent references to his own spirituality, which is significant. And so it appears that Luke has in mind early readers who see themselves continuing in Jesus' own pattern in terms of their worship life, in terms of their prayer life. All right. 10:09. There's a parable about the prodigal son and his brother. I want to give us a little bit of time to look at this. And I'm only going to show us the first part of the story. I'm going to leave out the older brother. I'm the younger of two brothers, so I get to do this. The older brother, though, is a very important part of the story. So don't forget, it's a longer story than what I'm going to show you. There is an older brother in this who resents the generosity of his father when his younger brother comes back home. So there's more to it than what I want to show you, but I want to lay before us, before we're done, this I think beautifully told parable. Remember, this comes after the parable of the lost sheep, after the parable of the lost coin. Jesus said there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the wealth that will belong to me." So he divided his assets between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant region. And there he squandered his wealth in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that region, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that region, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.'" Let me pause there. In the 2 parables before this, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, when it concludes, Jesus says about both of those that there's more joy in heaven about one sinner who repents than there is about others who don't need to repent. In other words, both of those stories are about repentance of some kind. What's interesting about this is it never says the younger son repents. That word just doesn't appear. It says that he came to his senses. And so interpreters disagree here. Is this really the son saying, "I have no other choice, I'm going to humble myself and go to my father"? Or is this the son saying, "I know who's going to let me back in"? Right? This is dad. It's the son manipulating the goodwill of his father. And that's perhaps why he's rehearsing his speech before he goes back. Which is the right answer? Great question. Probably depends on your family system in some way. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, "Father," here comes the speech, "I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his slaves, "Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. More food, right, in Luke's gospel. I want to leave you with